March 4, 1944. 11:47 in the morning. Berlin. The air raid sirens wail across the Reichshauptstadt like wounded animals. In the command bunker beneath Leipziger Strasse, General Major Adolf Galland stands motionless before a tactical map, his Knight's Cross catching the dim electric light. His fingers trace the red markers representing incoming bomber formations. But it is not the bombers that hold his gaze. It is the small blue annotations scribbled in the margins by the radar operators. Asterisk Begleitjäger, escort fighters. Range, unprecedented. Type, unknown. Speed, extraordinary. Asterisk. Above the city, the sound arrives before the sight. Not the familiar drone of heavy bombers, but something sharper, cleaner. A mechanical scream cutting through clouds at 400 miles per hour. Then they appear. 73 silver silhouettes, their tear-shaped fuselages gleaming like polished daggers against the gray March sky. P-51 Mustangs. American long-range fighters. Over Berlin. In daylight. For the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe's most decorated commanders understand with crystalline clarity. The shield is broken. For nearly 5 years, distance had been Germany's invisible fortress. The Third Reich had built its war machine on a calculated assumption that Allied bombers, no matter how numerous, could only strike the periphery of Hitler's empire. British raids came at night, groping blindly through darkness, their losses mounting with each mission. American B-17s flew in daylight with suicidal courage, but their escorts, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, could barely reach the German border before fuel reserves forced them to turn back. Beyond that invisible line, beyond the range of Allied fighters, the Luftwaffe ruled absolutely. German fighter squadrons waited like wolves at the edge of escort range, watching the American little friends peel away, watching the bomber formations suddenly naked and vulnerable. Then came the slaughter. On October 14, 1943, during the second raid on Schweinfurt, 60 B-17s were obliterated from the sky in a single afternoon. The Americans called it Black Thursday. The Germans called it vindication. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal of the Luftwaffe, had personally assured Hitler, asterisk, no enemy plane will fly over the Reich territory. Asterisk, it was not mere propaganda. It was strategic reality, grounded in the mathematics of fuel consumption, engine endurance, and the simple physics of distance. Berlin lay 550 miles from Allied bases in England. No fighter in existence could fly that far, fight, and return home. Until now. The German pilots expected March 4th to unfold like every other day of air combat over the Reich. They expected the American escorts to vanish somewhere over Hanover or Brunswick, right on schedule, fuel tanks emptying, their tactical maps pulling them back toward the Channel. They expected to own the sky for 2 precious hours while the flying fortresses lumbered toward their targets alone, defensive guns blazing uselessly against coordinated attacks from 12 o'clock high. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, a veteran ace with 33 confirmed kills, had perfected the technique. Wait for the escorts to leave. Position above and ahead of the bomber stream. Dive through the formation with cannons hammering, too fast for the defensive gunners to track. Climb, loop, attack again. It was brutal mathematics. Every mission, 5 to 8 bombers destroyed. Every mission, the Americans kept coming. But they came without fighter protection over the target. They came vulnerable. On March 4th, Knoke led his group toward the bomber formations with the confidence born of 200 combat missions. His Focke-Wulf 190 climbed through 18,000 feet, engine roaring, oxygen mask cold against his face. He searched the sky ahead, looking for the familiar silhouette of B-17s bristling with defensive guns. He found them. But he also found something else. The American fighters had not turned back. They were still there, weaving protective patterns around the bombers at 25,000 feet. Knoke's radio crackled with disbelief from his squadron. Asterisk, Indian are not here. Indians still here. Asterisk, the Americans called their fighters little friends. The Germans called them Indians, like the warriors from the Western films they had watched before the war, before the world caught fire. But these Indians did not leave. They circled over Berlin itself, sleek and impossibly fast, their distinctive bubble canopies glinting in the pale sunlight. And when Knoke's Group pressed their attack despite the odds, the Mustangs fell upon them with a fury that shattered formations and scattered veterans like startled birds. What they experienced was not merely defeat. It was obsolescence. The Focke-Wulf 190, once the most feared fighter in European skies, suddenly felt heavy, sluggish, outmatched. The Mustangs turned inside them, accelerated past them, climbed above them with an ease that defied everything German pilots understood about aerial combat. Knoke survived the mission. 8 of his squadron did not. The appearance of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin represented more than tactical surprise. It represented the collision of 2 industrial philosophies, 2 approaches to warfare, 2 visions of what modern combat required. The Mustang itself was a monument to American pragmatism and cross-Atlantic cooperation. Designed by North American Aviation in 1940 to a British specification, initially powered by an inadequate Allison engine, the aircraft had been mediocre at best. But when British engineers married the American airframe to the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that drove the legendary Spitfire, something extraordinary emerged. The P-51B could fly farther, faster, and higher than any fighter in production. With drop tanks, it possessed a combat radius of 750 miles. 750 miles. The number haunted German strategic calculations like a curse. On that first Berlin mission, the 354th Fighter Group, flying Mustangs, escorted bombers to the target and back without losing a single aircraft. Within weeks, P-51 groups were flying daily missions over the Reich capital. The 8th Air Force could suddenly strike anywhere in Germany with impunity, their bombers wrapped in a protective envelope of fighters that German interceptors could not penetrate. Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, General of Fighter Forces, recorded his assessment with brutal honesty. Asterisk, the day I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up. Asterisk, in his post-war memoirs he elaborated, asterisk, we had expected the Americans to hit our industries, our cities, our infrastructure. We had not expected them to hit us with such overwhelming superiority in the air. The P-51 changed everything. Suddenly, we were fighting defensively over our own homeland, and we were losing. The statistics tell their own merciless story. In February 1944, before the Mustangs arrived in force, the 8th Air Force lost 299 heavy bombers. In March, with P-51s escorting to Berlin and beyond, losses dropped to 245 bombers. But Luftwaffe losses exploded. In March alone, German fighter forces lost 492 aircraft and 255 pilots killed or missing. An entire generation of combat veterans incinerated in a single month of desperate defensive battles. The Luftwaffe was bleeding to death over its own territory, and every commander from Göring downward understood the mathematics of attrition. America was producing fighters faster than Germany could train pilots to oppose them. The United States built 15,000 P-51 Mustangs during the war. Germany's entire fighter production for 1944 barely exceeded 20,000 aircraft of all types combined, and many of those never reached operational squadrons due to fuel shortages, pilot shortages, and the relentless Allied bombing of manufacturing centers. The arrival of Mustangs over Berlin transformed German strategic thinking in ways both immediate and profound. Tactically, Luftwaffe commanders faced an impossible dilemma. To defend against bomber formations, fighters had to concentrate in large numbers, the Großschlag, the Great Blow, where hundreds of interceptors would mass for coordinated attacks. But concentration meant vulnerability. P-51 pilots, aggressive and well-trained, actively hunted German fighters, pursuing them through clouds, down to the deck, across the landscape of the Reich itself. German pilots began reporting escort fighters at 30,000 feet, 40,000 feet, even 50,000 feet, altitudes where the rarefied air starved German engines, while Mustang performance barely suffered. The psychological impact cut deeper than tactical calculations. For the first time, German fighter pilots experienced what British, Soviet, and American pilots had endured during the dark years of German air superiority, the sickening awareness of flying obsolete equipment against a superior opponent. Every mission became a calculus of survival rather than victory. Experienced pilots developed cautious tactics, staying above or ahead of formations, making single passes and fleeing, conserving irreplaceable skill and experience rather than pressing attacks. New pilots lasted days, sometimes hours. Heinz Knoke, who survived the March 4th mission over Berlin, flew combat until the war's end. His diary entries chart a steady descent from confidence to fatigue to something approaching despair. By January 1945, he wrote, "We are fighting against an enemy who sends up 500 bombers escorted by 500 fighters. We send up 30 fighters. The outcome is predetermined. We fight anyway." But the transformation extended beyond pilots and tactics. At the highest levels of command, the appearance of P-51s over Berlin shattered the last illusions about Germany's strategic position. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, later testified that the sustained American air campaign of 1944, made possible by long-range fighter escorts, accomplished what no bombing raid had achieved before. It did not merely destroy factories and refineries. It paralyzed German industrial production by forcing a massive diversion of resources to air defense, by breaking transportation networks, by creating an environment where workers spent more time in shelters than on assembly lines. The Mustang became the symbol of something the Nazi leadership had never seriously considered: that American industrial capacity, married to technical excellence and strategic patience, could produce weapon systems that Germany simply could not match. The P-51 was not dramatically superior to German fighters in any single characteristic, but it combined range, speed, altitude performance, reliability, and industrial producibility into a package that represented everything the Luftwaffe could not achieve. Every silver fighter over Berlin carried a message written in aluminum and gasoline. You cannot win this war. Your homeland is not safe. Your cities are not protected. The distance that once shielded you has vanished. In the months following that first Berlin mission, a strange ritual developed in the skies over Germany. P-51 pilots, flying deep into enemy territory with fuel to spare, began carrying something beyond ammunition and oxygen. They carried certainty. The distinctive silhouette of the Mustang, with its sleek fuselage and laminar flow wing, became a recurring image in German newsreels, training films, and intelligence briefings. Luftwaffe recognition manuals dedicated entire pages to the aircraft, annotating its weaknesses, suggesting tactics, offering desperate advice to pilots who would face it in combat. But the subtext beneath every technical drawing whispered a truth that no propaganda could silence. This aircraft represents an enemy you cannot exhaust, cannot outproduce, cannot defeat through attrition. For American bomber crews, the Mustang became something more visceral. Guardian Angel rendered in aluminum. The bomber boys gave their escorts nicknames, painted their fuselages with the same affection they reserved for photographs of wives and sweethearts. When P-51s appeared, weaving their protective pattern above and around lumbering formations, radios crackled with relieved voices. Little friends at 12 o'clock high. Those words meant survival. They meant home. German soldiers and civilians, watching silver contrails crisscross the sky above their cities in broad daylight, understood the symbolism without needing translation. The Luftwaffe, which had bombed Warsaw and Rotterdam and London, which had been the visible symbol of German military supremacy, could no longer protect the homeland. Every contrail was a scar across the face of the Reich. Every flight of Mustangs represented a promise being kept by an enemy whose resources seemed bottomless, whose reach seemed infinite. The aircraft became a physical manifestation of strategic reality, that Germany was fighting an industrialized democracy whose productive capacity dwarfed the combined output of all Axis powers. One nation alone, the United States, was building 300,000 aircraft during the war years. One factory complex in Willow Run, Michigan, produced B-24 bombers at a rate of 1 per hour. The same industrial machinery that had manufactured automobiles and refrigerators and washing machines had been converted, practically overnight, into the most powerful military production apparatus in human history. And the Mustang, sleek and silver and almost beautiful despite its lethal purpose, symbolized that transformation perfectly. On May 8, 1945, Adolf Galland stood in a different room, in a different world. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Luftwaffe, which had begun the war as the most technologically advanced air force on Earth, had been reduced to boys flying obsolete jets from battered runways, always outnumbered, always running out of fuel, always waiting for the sound of Mustang engines screaming out of the sun. Years later, in the quiet of post-war reflection, Galland was asked to identify the moment he knew Germany would lose the war. He did not mention Stalingrad or Normandy or the fall of Berlin. He mentioned March 4, 1944, the day American fighters appeared over the capital, the day distance ceased to protect the Reich. The P-51 Mustang flew its last combat missions in the Korean War, a testament to design excellence that transcended its original purpose. But its true legacy was written not in kill ratios or combat records, but in what it represented to the men who faced it in 1944 and 1945. It represented the fundamental truth that totalitarian efficiency, no matter how ruthlessly organized, could not match the productive power of an aroused democracy. That a nation built on individual liberty and industrial capitalism, a nation that had been sleeping while Europe burned, could wake and arm itself with such overwhelming force that even the most fanatical resistance became futile. The Mustang was not merely a weapon. It was an argument expressed in aluminum and gasoline and mathematics. It said, "Your ideology promised invincibility, but invincibility requires more than will. It requires resources you do not possess, industrial capacity you cannot match, and a depth of societal strength that cannot be manufactured through propaganda or terror." When German commanders saw those silver silhouettes wheeling above Berlin in March 1944, they were witnessing the visible manifestation of their own defeat, not the defeat that would come on battlefields or in smoking cities, but the deeper defeat of a philosophy that had promised supremacy and delivered only ash. The war would continue for 14 more months. Millions more would die in desperate battles and final atrocities. But on that cold March morning, when the air raid sirens wailed and the Mustangs circled overhead in perfect formation, something fundamental shifted in the minds of men who had believed their cause was unstoppable. They looked up at the sky, at the endless stream of enemy aircraft flying deeper into Germany than any fighter had ever reached, and they understood what defeat looks like when it arrives not in a single catastrophic moment, but in the daily, relentless, undeniable presence of an enemy who controls the air above your capital, your cities, your homeland. The jig was up. The sky belonged to America now, and with it, the future.